exist. As the proverb says, tomorrow never comes. There is no such thing as tomorrow. There never will be, because time is always now.
Welcome to the Philosophical Minds Podcast, the podcast about the stuff we wonder about.
And other things.
Right, we are here with Trevor Polinsky. Trevor is someone who has always been kind and supportive of me and this podcast since fairly early on, and I just really appreciate him. He actually was the one who originally connected me with Warren of Evolved Alchemy. He himself is founder of Solar Nutraceuticals. He's been very active in the cannabis industry over the years, so he has a really great perspective on things of that nature as well. And so Trevor, welcome, and thank you for being here.
Hey, Sky. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. This is going to be great because there's a lot of crossover in our interests and a lot of interactions with the same exact humans, even, and on your path, you actually have interacted with quite a number of the people that I have interviewed, interestingly, which is awesome because you're someone that has a lot of great perspective, and that's something that I definitely value. So to start out, maybe we could start by telling people a little bit about your background and yourself and where you've been along your path and the connections you've made and all that.
Definitely. It's cool to finally get on here. I feel like I've interacted with most of the guests you've had on the podcast at this point. I've taken both the practical and operative alchemy workshops with Avery Hopkins. I met Raven at those workshops down in Taos. I've done Secunda and Tertia with Robert Bartlett. Mate and Daniel Wiseman have been extremely helpful in my metallic alchemy work. I had a chance to see Eric Dollard and Peter Lindemann speak at the Alternative Energy Science Conference in Idaho in July. I've been interacting with TJ Bell of Black Earth Alchemy, and he actually just sent me a gift from Mark Stavish, another one of your guests, yesterday. Courtney Cosgrove is a good friend of mine. Warren's probably one of my best friends. So much respect for that dude. He's taught me so much about alchemy, how to run a business, how electricity functions. It's been a huge blessing to be able to rent space at his lab and kind of get a peek behind the curtain, so to speak, of some of the projects he's working on. So it's cool to finally be on. As far as my background, I've been practicing alchemy for a few years now, starting to do some of my own research into different mechanical engineering and electrical engineering concepts, and kind of just consider myself sort of a jack of all trades for a lot of the topics you have on here.
Yeah, definitely. And you're also you're fairly knowledgeable in the realm of the cannabis world. And you recently went to, I think it was like a hemp expo or something like that. And I was wondering, just out of curiosity, what are some of like the new interesting maybe developments that are coming out these days in regards to all that?
Yeah, definitely. So I was at the CBD Expo Southeast in Orlando the week before last, and the hemp sector is such an interesting market, especially being an emerging industry. It's so volatile and evolves so quickly. So, recently a lot of the CBD companies are switching to something called Delta-8 THC. I think I cut out there for a sec, but so a lot of the companies are switching from CBD to something called Delta-8 THC, which is basically a non-classified isomer of THC that many states are allowing to be sold, even though they haven't necessarily passed medical cannabis legislation yet. So it was interesting, seeing a lot of these companies pivoting pretty hard and kind of taking a different direction with their marketing. We're also seeing something called THCO acetate hit the market, which is essentially a synthetic prodrug of Delta 8 THC, which is reportedly 3 to 5 times more potent and has more of a psychedelic effect than standard CBD or THC, I think you could say.
Wow, that's fascinating. Yeah. So what are your thoughts on the Delta 8 and the I think you said TCO? What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that these are beneficial versions or not so beneficial, or yeah, what can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. So it's an interesting field. So Delta 8 THC is a natural cannabinoid that's produced by the hemp plant, but it's produced in such small amounts that essentially all the Delta 8 products on the market, they're not being extracted naturally from the plant. What manufacturers are doing is they're taking CBD isolate and they're dissolving it in a dry hydrocarbon solvent, and then they're using an acid catalyst to essentially rearrange the molecule, and they're converting the CBD into Delta 8 THC. So even though Delta 8 THC is a natural cannabinoid, it is being synthesized, and it's important to understand the distinction because most people don't really know what they're putting in their body and whether it was derived from hemp or synthesized in a lab.
Wow, that's fascinating. And then what was the other thing that you had mentioned? I think, did you say TCO or something like that?
Yes, it's THCO acetate. And so it's kind of funny, so these companies they're taking their CBD isolate and then they convert it into Delta 8 THC, which is a natural cannabinoid, but they are synthesizing it, as I mentioned. And then they're taking that Delta 8 THC and then they're putting it through another synthesis process where they convert the Delta 8 THC into Delta 8 THCO acetate. And when they do this, it becomes much more potent, much more psychedelic. But now we're getting into the realm of completely synthetic molecules that are not found anywhere in nature, which is interesting. I mean, we ingest synthetic molecules, and 95% of what we find on the shelf at the grocery store, we really live in a synthetic society, so to speak. So I don't know if there's necessarily anything specifically wrong with that, but it's an interesting time. There hasn't been really any long-term safety studies done on these products. There's weird legal loopholes as far as selling synthetic molecules to the public for human consumption and how they're marketed. I don't know how the FDA is going to want to come in and regulate that, if it's going to be federally mandated versus, individual state guidelines. So we'll kind of see how it shakes out, and something to keep in mind, though, is, with the popcorn lung from the vape products that were on the market a few years ago, the ingredient that was causing these adverse health effects from people inhaling these vaporizers was the vitamin E acetate that was being added to the vape cartridges to give people a thicker hit with more smoke when they inhale on it. And we're now finding out that this vitamin E acetate, when vaporized, can be toxic to the lungs. So the fact that they're now putting THCO acetate into a vape cartridge and selling it, we don't really know how safe this is yet. If having 2% vitamin E acetate in a vape cartridge was enough to damage people's lungs and supposedly kill people, we don't know if the acetate molecule that's attached to the THCO is going to have the same effect. So we'll see how the market regulates itself, and if the government agencies want to come in and set guidelines or mandates, and we'll see what happens there.
Wow. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's interesting because I'm all for, I mean, I think it's cool that there are agencies that are set up to kind of help give, I guess, educate and give information. But on the other hand, it's like the FDA and their history over the years. I don't know. They're a little suspect, in my opinion. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't have a whole lot of respect for the FDA, to be honest. From my perspective, they have a history of approving things that are not safe while outlawing things that are safe. Just last week, or a couple weeks ago now, they ruled that CBD cannot be classified as a dietary supplement, but it also cannot be classified as a food ingredient. And so all of the CBD companies are like, well, okay, what do we put on our label then? Like, what is this? And they're like, oh, we're going to release new labeling guidelines soon. And you're like, well, okay, but like, how do we sell this product now legally? And they're like, what? So there's a lot of inconsistency there with how it's being regulated. And to a certain extent, it seems that it's being done on purpose as an attempt to crush the industry. The FDA has approved so many things that are not really safe. Most of the high fructose corn syrup on the market has extremely high levels of glyphosate, and they don't talk about that. One of their own food scientists that worked for the FDA, Renee Default, found that 50% of the high fructose corn syrup had dangerous levels of mercury present, and actually alerted her superiors, and they did nothing about it. Nitrites and nitrates are, approved as preservatives in food, even though they create an increased risk of cancer and blood disorders. Artificial colorings, red 3 is known to cause cancer in animals. Red 40, yellow 5, yellow 6 contain something called benzidine, which is linked to bladder and pancreatic cancer. And then when we get to artificial flavorings, it gets even weirder. So artificial flavorings is an umbrella term for 700 different synthetic compounds that the major food manufacturers can use in their formulations. And if you have 2 or more out of those 700 different synthetic compounds in your formulation, you don't have to list what it is. You can just write, all flavor ingredients in this product are approved for use and regulation of the FDA. And that's their Code of Federal Regulations, Title 21. And so like, when you dig deeper, you find out that these compounds are not even voted on by the FDA, but they actually receive suggestions from a group called the Flavor Extract Manufacturers Association, or FEMA for short. And so FEMA is literally made up of employees of the major food manufacturers. And this is the group that tells the FDA what should be considered safe to put in their artificial flavorings umbrella, which the whole thing is kind of ludicrous. It'd be like the equivalent of ExxonMobil employees telling the Environmental Protection Agency what the fuel emission regulations should be. And the FDA was actually recently sued because 7 of these compounds have been proven to cause cancer. They've approved aspartame, which has been linked to non-Hodgkin lymphoma and multiple myeloma. The nutritional neuroscience study found it to be a chemical stressor linked to adverse effects on behavioral health. They've approved sodium benzoate, which we now know when combined with vitamin C actually converts to benzene, which is a carcinogen that causes bone marrow failure. A 5-year study by the Journal of Agricultural Food Chemistry found that benzene concentrates in common food and drinks were actually 20 times the maximum contaminant levels set by the EPA. They've approved brominated vegetable oil, which is banned in Europe and Japan.
Wow.
So lots of
Yeah.
sketchy compounds have been approved by the FDA, but meanwhile, something like CBD, which we know to be pretty safe, cannot even be called a dietary supplement or a food ingredient. And 2 years ago, I was at a event in Florida. It was a CBD Mastermind Summit, and there was actually an individual there who worked for the FDA for 25 years. And I had a chance to talk to him privately, and he now does CGMP consulting. So he'll come into labs, he'll do a walkthrough, he'll let you know what's not up to par. They leave, they come back the next day, hopefully you fixed what they told you to, and then they go through and they give you a checklist. And if you pass, you get this certification saying that you practice good manufacturing standards. But we got talking, about some of these things that I just brought up, and I was like, how can the FDA, pass these things that we know are not safe? And he said, do you know what it takes for the FDA to pass something? And I said, no. And he goes, $4.2 billion. I said, excuse me? He says, $4.2 billion. I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, if you pay the FDA $4.2 billion, they'll create the study that finds, whatever effects you want it to have, and that's what they'll publish. And so I was like, so is that how aspartame got passed? And he said, yes. And I said, you're kidding me. He goes, no, we had to do 20 different studies because the first 19 studies found that it was toxic. But when we got that 20th study, we could cite that and run with that. So, from my vantage point, this is just one of the most corrupt organizations in the country, if not the planet.
Wow. Yeah. And that guy's sketch, as far as I'm concerned. I've actually done some research on him as well. Straight up corruption. I mean, it's just the data's out there and it's been out there. And like you had said, in other countries, they've had a lot of these substances that are harmful and proven toxic and harmful, approved, or I mean, regulated as far as putting them in stores and whatnot. And yeah, I mean, 4.2 billion, what the fuck? That's crazy.
It literally is, and then you look at current events right now. So like Scott Gottlieb was the head of the FDA from 2017 to 2019. And then 2019, he was paid $350,000 a year to come work for Pfizer. This should be extremely alarming, so this is like, a lawyer will spend like the first part of their career doing criminal prosecution, and then they switch to criminal defense so that they know the guys on the other side of the bar, those are their buddies and they know how to play the system. Or it's like a financial analyst working for the SEC for the first part of their career and then getting paid off to come work for Goldman Sachs, or, members of the Environmental Protection Association paid off to come work for ExxonMobil. And it's really unfortunate how often the individuals who are supposed to be regulating the safety of American citizens are paid off by the exact companies they're supposed to be regulating.
Yeah, it's wild. So I'm curious about, are there any interesting like medical studies kind of that come to your mind in reference to just all the stuff that's going on right now? I guess with COVID in particular, that would be kind of something interesting to talk about as well.
Yeah, definitely. I'm glad you brought that up. There was actually a study was published by the Israeli Journal of Medical Science that came out August 24th. So just over 2 weeks ago now. And, I have some of the highlights here from the study, and I'll just go ahead and read off some quotes that really stood out to me. The first one being that the natural immune protection that develops after a COVID infection offers considerably more of a shield against the Delta variant of the pandemic coronavirus than 2 doses of the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine. The newly released data show people who once had a COVID infection were much less likely than never infected vaccinated people to get Delta develop symptoms from it, or become hospitalized with serious COVID-19. The study, conducted in one of the most highly COVID-19 vaccinated countries in the world, examined medical records of tens of thousands of Israelis, charting their infections, symptoms, and hospitalizations between June 1st and August 14th, when the Delta variant predominated in Israel. It's the largest real-world observational study so far to compare natural and vaccine-induced immunity to COVID-19, according to its leaders. They went on to say that it's a textbook example of how natural immunity is really better than vaccination, says Charlotte Phelan, a physician and immunology researcher at Danderyd Hospital and the Karolinska Institute, who studies the immune responses to COVID-19. The study found in two analyses that infected people who were vaccinated in January and February were in June, July, and the first half of August 6 to 13 times more likely to get infected than unvaccinated people who were previously infected with the coronavirus. In one analysis comparing more than 32,000 people in the health system, the risk of developing symptomatic COVID-19 was 27 times higher among the vaccinated, and the risk of hospitalization was 8 times higher. This group published data showing people who recover from COVID-19 infection continue to develop increasing numbers and types of coronavirus targeting antibodies for up to 1 year. By contrast, twice vaccinated people stop seeing increases in the potency or the breadth of overall memory antibody compartment a few months after their second dose. For many infectious diseases, naturally acquired immunity is known to be more powerful than vaccine-induced immunity, and it often lasts a lifetime. So that last part right there is incredibly important. It often lasts a lifetime. So let's remember that, and we'll circle back to that later. But after seeing that in black and white, in my humble opinion, believing that vaccines are superior to natural antibodies is the equivalent of believing that baby formula is superior to your mother's milk. I don't think that you can beat nature, no matter how good your science is. I think, nature knows best. So what's really interesting is that the FDA actually approved the Pfizer biotech vaccine the literal day before this article was published. And I personally don't believe that to be a coincidence. So what's also very interesting is that the long-term safety studies on the Pfizer biotech vaccine won't be complete for another 2 to 3 years. So what I want to know is, how can the FDA approve something that we don't have any long-term safety studies done on? This is like giving a freshman a high school diploma because they did really well their first year. It's like, okay, well, cool, you still got 3 more years of school. So this article was published on August 24th, and on September 1st, a week later, Scott Gotiliev was quoted in a CNBC article stating that people who had COVID won't be immune and should still get vaccinated. And he went on to say that my hunch is that natural immunity is not going to last in perpetuity, and those individuals who were previously infected with COVID should still get vaccinated. This should be quite alarming. We have, the head of a biopharmaceutical organization that is, basically lying to the American public. There's data proving that what he's saying is simply false, and no one seems to be fact checking these statements. The Pfizer BioNTech group is projecting $40.7 billion in vaccine sales in 2021. And if you calculate the potential revenue for the 2.5 billion vaccines the company states it will produce, the figure actually comes to 50 billion in revenue just this year. So, even if we take the conservative figures, we're looking at over $100 million a day in revenue. And if the companies that are bringing this in are falsifying data and straight up lying to us in order to make this money, that's quite cause for concern, in my opinion. And the irony of, we're recording this on the 20-year anniversary of 9/11. Not to sound radical, but terrorism is defined as the unlawful use of violence or intimidation, especially against civilians, in the pursuit of political aims. And a company that's intimidating the American public to make $50 billion a year, that sounds like the pursuit of political aims to me. And the fact that we're now mandating medical autonomy based on a self-admitted hunch should be quite concerning.
Yeah, I would say. And oh man, all for these experimental profitable mRNA vaccines, and that's not to mention these like the cytotoxic spike protein problem that's been observed and verified. It's not staying within the injection site like it was intended to, and it occasionally, I guess, it's crossing the blood-brain barrier, and that's been demonstrated in human cell cultures. I think the Salk Institute, they did a paper on that with brain tissue samples or something along those lines. And yeah, these spike proteins are causing all kinds of issues. They've discovered autopsies that that are linked with those. They've been found, throughout various tissue types of the body following vaccination. And there's like a lipid nanoparticle layer that is designed to protect the mRNA, I guess, in order to get the spike proteins into the cells. So now this coating material is just like lingering around in the body, causing who knows what kind of problems. I believe it's causing the blood clotting issues from, scientists that I've heard discuss it, and particularly within the ovaries, for example. And yeah, these aren't my words. These are from doctors and biologists that get into all of this stuff. And this, suppression of other forms of treatment that actually, seem to work. It's just sad that it seems like that conversation is kind of being shut down, and so that these like larger entities can promote their own versions of their, bullshit stories to profit, versus something like like ivermectin is something that seems like a lot of people have had benefit with. It's like anti-inflammatory, and there was I think it was an interesting interview that I'd watched with Brett Weinstein, where he actually interviewed the dude that was one of the inventors of the mRNA technology that was really skeptical about it and basically not in favor. And he was the dude that actually invented it. So it's crazy, man. And to think that like things like that are beneficial, like I know something you're familiar with is like ozone technology. What's going on with that?
Yeah, so this kind of circles back to further mistrust I have with the FDA. And I'm certainly a little bit biased from working in the hemp industry for the last 5 years, and watch how they've apparently intentionally crushed it, the industry, with the fact that we can't make any claims on anything. We know it's anti-inflammatory, but we can't put that on the bottle or else we get sued, so on and so forth. But ozone's a great example of another beneficial compound that's been outlawed by the FDA. According to Title 21, Volume 8 of the Code of Federal Regulations, ozone is defined as a toxic gas with no known useful medical application in specific adjunctive or preventative therapy. And what we actually know now is that ozone therapy increases the production of cancer-fighting compounds and strengthens various parts of the immune system that are suppressed by chronic infection and cancer. And they found that ozone therapy actually helps stop the growth of human cancer cells from breast, lung, and uterus by 40 up to 90%. Other beneficial healing properties that we've recently discovered: it's shown to boost the immune system, it's an antibacterial, an antifungal, an antiviral, it's shown to reverse damage to brain tissue after a stroke, lower risk of repeat heart attacks, helps with joint mobility, detoxing, wound healing, stem cell activation, repair, oxygenation of cells, and skin rejuvenation. And these are all, proven properties of something that's defined as a toxic gas with no known useful medical applications.
Oh my gosh. And that's just for ozone. And I'm sure there's other potential interesting gases as well that who knows what kind of benefits they have. They just haven't been popularized. Are there any other ones that you're familiar with?
Absolutely. So, when I was at the Alternative Energy Science Conference in Idaho in July, Dr. James DeMio was presenting, and he was talking about something called radon. So radon is a radioactive gas that's actually emanated from radium deposits. And he was referencing and citing these stories of these miners in the radium mines who had these serious health complications before they went into the mine. And they found almost miraculously that while working in the mine that they were, healing these health complications. And Dr. James DeMio attributed these healing properties to the radon gas that they were being exposed to in the mines. So, ironically, people actually seek out mineral springs with elevated radon levels due to the healing properties of the gas, which is, once again, considered toxic by the FDA.
Wow. Yeah, radon gas is something I haven't done a lot of research on, but that's super interesting and fascinating about that story with the miners. And it seems like a lot of these springs have a lot of beneficial properties from what I hear. That's really interesting. But yeah, radioactivity is, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, absolutely. And, I feel like, just the fact that it's considered a radioactive gas, tends to freak most people out. And there seems to just be a lot of lack of understanding as far as, what radioactivity actually means. And, is it dangerous, or could it potentially have beneficial properties for the human body? So radioactivity is defined as the emission of ionizing particles by the disintegration of atomic nuclei. So there's essentially three different types of particle emissions, and those are alpha, beta, and gamma. So alpha particle emissions consist of 2 protons and 2 neutrons that are bound together, and it's essentially identical to a helium nucleus. It has a positive charge. It's the largest particle out of the 3 emission categories, and it's the least penetrative, and it's actually considered to be fairly safe. And the alpha particle is what the radon gas emits. So there's also beta emitters, which are high energy electrons. They have a negative charge. These, you kind of start to get into a gray area with beta particles. They can be considered somewhat dangerous, and we don't know what the potential long-term effect are on exposure to human beings and what that could cause. And then we get into gamma particles, which are waves of electromagnetic energy, also known as photons, and these are the same as X-rays that you use to take pictures of organs or bones or things of that nature. And the gamma emanations are considered to be fairly dangerous. So it's like alpha, good, beta kind of neutral, gamma bad, to really dumb it down. But like I said, so radon emits alpha particles, which are known to be safe.
That is
What's
so
really interesting
fascinating.
about this too, Yeah, so there's something called transcranial direct stimulation, and it's currently being used by the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, also known as DARPA. For those of you who are not familiar with DARPA, it's kind of like a black ops military research branch that is investigating essentially anything you've ever seen in a sci-fi movie. So they're using this, technology, the transcranial direct stimulation, where they're, essentially, using electricity to supercharge people's brains. And they're finding that when they train, they're using it on training for Marine Scout snipers and jet fighter pilots to increase learning speeds by 40%. So it works great for them because they can train soldiers on these, fairly complex operations at lightning speed. So there seems to be a correlation between, electricity and charged particles. We know that the military knows that you can use electricity to, increase the learning capacity of humans, and there appears to be other beneficial properties of these charged particle exposure, such as the alpha particles from radon, to enhance human abilities.
Wow, holy shit, that's amazing. So I did have one question about when you're talking about the gamma rays, you're talking about X-rays, and I remember reading something about Tesla's work with X-rays, and he was able to do them a little bit differently. And I don't know if you're familiar with any of the effects, but from what I understood, it wasn't as harmful, and it was actually a lot more effective in terms of being able to give really accurate scans or something along those lines. I don't know. Are you familiar with any of that?
Yeah, so I have a surface level understanding of Tesla's work with gamma particles or X-rays, and it's reported that he had actually developed a system where he could use gamma particles or X-rays to photograph someone from up to 20 feet away, which is, so far beyond what we can currently do, with our medical system. I mean, you go to the doctor and you're getting an X-ray of, a bone or something. I mean, they're putting it, it's almost touching, your body when they're trying to take this picture. Whereas, it sounds like Tesla had figured out how to take pictures with these particles from across a room, which is pretty amazing.
Wow, that's wild. Yeah, but yeah, back to like the radioactivity thing. I think this is something that can, it's like next level alchemy for the future as far as all this is concerned. What are your thoughts on that? I think you had mentioned something along the lines of the radioactive and the connections between like the different planets and all that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think anyone who studies metallic alchemy specifically should be very intrigued by the potential correspondences of these radioactive compounds and how they relate to their kind of like ruling astrological archetype. We know in alchemy it's all about the ruling planets over the metals. So Saturn rules over lead, Jupiter rules over tin, Mars rules over iron, Venus rules over copper, Mercury rules over mercury, the moon rules silver, and the sun rules gold. And it kind of just stops there. And no one really talks about Uranus, Neptune, or Pluto, which is very interesting. It's almost like there's kind of almost been like a conspiracy to kind of keep quiet about these, three ruling planets and their corresponding, physical, metal that relates. And, interesting enough, Uranus, we know that uranium is radioactive. Neptune, the element that comes in the periodic table after uranium is actually called neptunium, which is also radioactive. And, plutonium, even more radioactive. So it would be really interesting to see, if you apply the acetate path or the other metallic alchemy processing techniques to radioactive ore, where do the charged particles go? If you're familiar with the processing of metallic oils or just alchemy in general, you're separating the spirit from, the soul, which is the oil, from the body, which is the salt, and then you put them all back together and you react them, and you have your spagyric. Specifically with metallic alchemy, you really just want your oil, because the salts are pretty toxic, and you have to go through intense sweetening processes to make sure that you don't have any residual heavy metals in there, and that it is a pure product. But what would the oil of uranium look like? The same way that the rest of the metallic oils don't contain any of their metal in the finished product. Well, at least they're not supposed to. In theory, you could extract an oil from uranium that would not have any toxic heavy metals in it, and could have potential very powerful healing properties, and we don't really know. But what's really interesting would be to study where do the charged particles go. We know you can separate the three principles: the oil, the salt, and the spirit. But where does the radioactivity go? When you separate these principles, are the charged particles in the salt? Are they in the oil? Are they in the spirit? What happens when you separate these principles and recombine them? Can you somehow increase the charged particle emission? What does that look like? I think these are, pretty interesting questions that it doesn't really seem like anyone's currently investigating.
Yeah, I'm with you 100%, and that's so cool. I'm glad that you brought that up, especially with the uranium, neptunium, and plutonium connection, because I've always been curious looking at those if they had some kind of correspondence, because I've heard some herbal correlations made in a few books that I've read between the outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, but not so much metallic connection. I think that's like something that's super under researched, and I don't know too much about the properties of those particular elements, but I think you're totally on the ball about that's something that we definitely should be curious and looking into, because it's just interesting that they are labeled as that name and then realm of radioactivity. What I wanted to ask you too is, because we're talking about metallic oils, and everybody, it seems, is always creating and focusing on metallic oils, but what about like metallic spagyrics that encompass like all elements? Is there a reason why there is not a focus? At least it seems like it's more about the oil, but not creating like a holistic like a quintessence, so to speak. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, definitely. So when you're processing metallic oils, the salts are toxic. You're dealing with toxic heavy metal salts of your precursor starting compound, and the spirit is we're no plant spirits, that's safe. It's ethanol. You can drink alcohol. It's not going to do any damage to you. But philosophic mercury, the spirit of metals, that has acetone and acetic acid and acetaldehyde and acetic anhydride and these kind of weird sketchy solvents that the science says you don't want to be putting in your body. So it's more of kind of like a path I see, with the spirit and the salt is really a way to obtain your oil, which is really the good stuff. And there's lots of different philosophies, as far as how to produce these products and how to do them in a safe way, that they can potentially be ingested, and have beneficial properties on the body. I know there's more and more people out there that don't think that they are safe to ingest. Some people think that they just need to be prepared properly, but now the debate is, okay, well, what is the proper preparation? Also, with the salts, I see the salts as more of like a catalyst, and you can use the salts to react with the spirit and the oil, and you can create your quintessence, but then you need to distill your spirit back out, and then also make sure you remove your salts, and then go through a extensive sweetening process to make sure that your finished product doesn't have any of those salts in there. So I see those as kind of like co-catalysts in a reaction, but you don't want those catalysts in your finished product when it comes time to ingest it. With the outer realms, the neptunium, uranium, plutonium, going through the alchemical process with these, separating the three principles and recombining them, it's possible that maybe the oil from these compounds is not meant to be ingested. Maybe we're getting into more like power generation potential and electrical applications. That might be why they're not talked about, in classical alchemical ores. They might be dangerous. There might not be a safe way to prepare them, but we don't really know.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's actually a really insightful, because I'm kind of still in the midst of learning about a lot of the metallic stuff myself. So it's really cool to get that perspective. And I think you're right about that. Maybe it's not meant to be ingested, but as far as technological uses, I mean, it seems like the limits are pretty much like limitless. In terms of like technological utilization, what are some kind of interesting things that you think that they might be used for potentially?
Yeah, so if you're familiar with like the acetate path for processing a metal into an oil, you take your metal and you oxidize it, you burn it, and then you react that oxidized form with acetic acid, and you convert your oxide into an acetate. So interesting enough, if you take uranium and you oxidize it and then react with acetic acid, you're going to create something called uranyl acetate, which is known as yellow cake. And it's used in nuclear fission. It's literally used for, nuclear power generation. And if you take a particle accelerator and you direct, it's either, charged particles at your uranium, you can basically move it up through the periodic table and essentially transmute it into neptunium. And then if you do the same thing to neptunium, you can then essentially use the charged particles to transmute that into plutonium, and that's how plutonium's made. So we absolutely know that there is potential for power generation and electrical applications with these compounds. Unfortunately, the ways that they're currently being utilized are not very efficient and pretty toxic and dangerous. And there's a lot of speculation that it's done this way on purpose, because a lot of the toxic compounds that are created during this process are actually used as precursors for nuclear weapons. And so, there have been research that have come forward and presented ways that we could, maybe do nuclear fusion instead of nuclear fission and have, a clean nuclear energy. But the government doesn't seem to be interested in that, because, then where are they going to get the precursors to make their bombs?
Wow. Yeah. I mean, I definitely would say it's intentional and on purpose, because I've heard way too many stories. A lot of them, actually, Warren had shared a few of them as well. It seems like some things that have extremely large amount of potential end up kind of disappearing or kind of being shut down, unfortunately. So I hope that there's a potential for that to change. I don't know.
Definitely. And so, particle accelerators is such an interesting thing. Using those to, transmute elements is fascinating, but, they have a lot of other applications as well that are super interesting, specifically in the electro-gravitics field. So, our current aerospace technology that's disclosed to the public is like pretty basic when you know what organizations like DARPA have kind of cooking off the books, so to speak. There's something called electric vertical takeoff lift devices, kind of like miniature aviation vehicles that can lift straight off the ground. So like two of those products in the market right now are the opener Blackfly, which uses a propeller system to lift off, and it's kind of like the first flying car, essentially, where it's a singular piloted aircraft that only weighs a couple hundred pounds, and you can vertically take off. You don't need to gain speed. There's no wheels or anything like that. And then you have the Zapata racing flyboard, which is using jet turbines, which are pretty loud and gas powered. So fairly not super sophisticated technology, essentially. There's a lot of evidence that there's much more advanced technology that's used behind the scenes that kind of just isn't disclosed to the American public. But I've been what's the potential for using high voltage power systems or particle accelerators for ion thrust propulsion systems. And there's a book written by PhD Paul Laviolette that kind of goes into some of the secrets of anti-gravity propulsion. So these were a couple of things that really stood out to me while reading this book. He states that the physics theories that academics and most laboratory physicists currently understand, teach, and write about are grossly in error. A very advanced and much more accurate theoretical framework has been developed by scientists of the Black programs community, but its fundamentals presently remain classified. From the standpoint of this new physics, modern physics concepts used in the conventional world, such as relativity theory, quantum electrodynamics, and quantum mechanics, are referred to as classical concepts. That is, they are regarded as terribly outdated. And so he does actually go into, a literal example of this technology that's been used for decades, in plain sight, and that's the B-2 stealth bomber. So Aviation Week and Space Technology Magazine made the surprising disclosure that the B-2 electrostatically charges its exhaust stream and the leading edges of its wing-like body, which was a big deal for them to come out and say that. The scientists that broke their code of silence, this essentially rivals the mafia's code of silence. Disclosing military technology to the public media is, for lack of a better term, dangerous. The military really doesn't want people to know about a lot of this technology. The fact that they're applying high voltage charge to aircraft hulls, it's not something they really want people talking about for the most part. So they go into some of the more kind of like advanced theory about how the operations apply, and he talks about how the applied electric potential would produce a coronal glow that would propagate forward from the craft's leading edges to ionize and repel air molecules upwind of the aircraft, and the resulting repulsive electric forces would condition the airstream so as to lower drag, reduce heating, and soften or eliminate the sonic boom. The results showed that when high voltage DC is applied to a wing-shaped structure subjected to a supersonic flow, seemingly new electro-aerodynamic qualities appear that result in significant air drag reduction on the structure, and the virtual elimination of friction caused aerodynamic heating as well as the elimination of shockwave and wave drag phenomena. So with a positively charged wing leading edge and a negatively charged exhaust stream, the B2 would function essentially as an electrogravitic aircraft. It's the first anti-gravity aircraft disclosed to the public that operates on a charged particle application. This aircraft control and propulsion technology is based on physics that go beyond what is currently known and understood by the general public, as well as most academic physics. The AC energization technique may also be used to provide vertical thrust to the B2, thereby allowing it to hover. So it's reported that this craft can actually fly around the world without refueling due to the massive power supply built in. What's also interesting is that the oxide coatings on the wings increase the ionization. I thought that was interesting based on what we know of, alchemy processing techniques, how you have to oxidize your metals before you can convert them into an acetate. I'm wondering if there is some connection to the ionization potential of the oxidation and how that relates to the acetate conversion process. Consumer electrogravitic devices do exist, and I had the opportunity to witness videos of some devices that were built by Russell Anderson, who presented at the Tesla Tech conference in Albuquerque last month. So he didn't have these devices with him, but he had videos of, essentially this, piece of, what appeared to be glass that he was, charging, and it would actually exert, electrogravitic kind of, hovering effect. So that was pretty cool to see.
Wow. You said it, Russell Anderson, was that his name?
Yeah. So Russell Anderson worked with John Searle right up until his death. So John Searle created something called the Searle effect generator, but it's essentially a magnet motor that once started is self-propelled and continuously increases charge and creates excess electricity as it operates. Essentially one of the first over unity applications that's been publicly disclosed.
Oh, that's crazy. Yeah, you've been to a lot of these energy science conferences and stuff. You should probably have a lot of really amazing and interesting interactions with different folks. And I bet you just have all kinds of interesting little insights into different technologies. What are some of the other things or people or devices that you've seen that you find pretty fascinating?
Yeah. So in Idaho, there's a gentleman that's working on a next generation engine that reportedly gets, I believe it was 250 miles per gallon. It was so interesting because we're like, oh, cool. So you're starting a car company, right? And he's like, no, absolutely not. I'm like, why? He's like, oh, it's they control that way too much. They would crush it. And so what he's doing is he's putting it in lawnmowers and mopeds, and his plan is to just sell as many of these lawnmowers and mopeds as he can. And then by the time the major automobile manufacturers find out that this engine is already in production and being sold, it'll be too late. There'll be too many of them out there, and then they can't stop the technology from getting out there. So I thought that was super interesting.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's a really smart way to do it. I mean, you got to do things that way these days.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, but we got to do what we got to do, it seems.
Definitely. So you were at that energy science conference in Idaho, and I believe that was the one that Eric Dollard was at as well. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what was presented as far as that is concerned.
Yeah, definitely. So it was really interesting going there. My two of my favorite books are by Gustave Le Bon, and it's the Evolution of Matter and the Evolution of Forces. And Eric Dollard actually referenced both of those in his presentation. And after the conference, I found a paper he wrote, specifically about those two books that had some really interesting points. And I kind of wanted to read some quotes that, I found to be fascinating from his paper, called The Revival of the Science of Electricity in the Digital Age. It's essentially, he's basically making the point that the electron does not actually exist. And basically what happened is that when we discovered the force of the ether, we couldn't figure out how to quantify and, come up with formulas and equations for it. And so we just abolished it and, came up with something called the electron instead. And a lot of people think that physics took a wrong turn 100 years ago that has really been detrimental to the entire development of society. So these were, some of the quotes from his paper that really stood out to me. The mathematicians were drawing up formulae, the physicists were making experiments, and these experiments fitted less with the formulae. So soon as the equations no longer agreed with the experiments, the equations were rectified by imagining quote unquote hidden forces which completely baffled observation. He goes on to quote Nikola Tesla, who once remarked that the discovery of the Aether was as significant in his era as was the discovery of fire for the primitive man. Yet the Aether was abolished from classical quote unquote science. And the justification for this was that no physical model could be devised that could survive the test of experiment. And this is no surprise since the Aether is not physical. Accordingly, it is outside the realm of physical science. So, essentially because we cannot understand the Aether, we created the concept of the electron. Rene Descartes was quoted, "It is thus erroneous to regard the heavenly bodies as isolated in vacant space. Around and between them is an incessant conveyance and transformation of energy to the vehicle of this activity. The name Aether has been given." Michael Faraday stated that this electric Aether can be expressed in practical terms as an electric fluid. This is really fascinating to me. I don't know about you, but the concept that the planets are floating in an electro-fluid ocean rather than just spinning in a vacuum sounds pretty cool to me. So Gustave Le Bon had a similar viewpoint, and he said what is called electricity proceeds solely from phenomena from the so-called displacement of the electric fluid or of its elements. And Le Bon continued that the concept of the electron is one of the most unfortunate metaphysical ideas recently formulated. The electron has become at present day a sort of fetish for many physicists by which they think to explain all phenomena. J.J. Thomson remarked that, at one point he said, "Here's to the electron, may it be of no use to anyone," which was really interesting because Thomas was literally credited with the quantification of the so-called electron. So, no one knows what he would have to gain by discrediting it. Charles Steinmetz outright rejected the electron concept, or what he sometimes calls the ionic theory of electricity. And he goes on to say that after the introduction of the myth of Santa Claus, we as children are also taught that electricity is the flow of electrons. It is later learned the truth of Santa, but the fallacy of the electron persists. So the electron represents a phenomenon of electronics, but it is not a phenomenon of electricity. Moreover, the motion of the electron is representative of the time rate of the destruction of electric induction. This is what we know as resistance. And we find that there is no steady state when the resistance is zero. The smaller the resistance, the greater the time taken for the current to get into the conductor from its boundary, where it is initiated, and the limit with no resistance, it never gets in at all. So essentially, without resistance, electric tension is not possible. Which is super interesting. So, I try to think of that, like how, can this electrical engineering concept apply to humans in their daily lives, and what value does resistance have to us as humans? And it's, very similar how I think of, you need a challenge for growth. It's almost like, like weightlifting in order to, have that muscle expansion, but you have to like apply that reverse pressure in order to resist and grow. So one of the coolest, probably the coolest part of that conference was Eric Dollard unveiling what he termed a cosmic induction generator. So it basically turned two Tesla resonant coils towards each other, which concentrates the dielectric field into a small area. And this is somehow creating ionization of gases, but is puzzling since none of the typical ionization spectrum colors are seen. And it's also creating tiny little galaxy-like balls of ionized gas. And so this seems to have a lot to do with the creation of physical reality. It was, watching this, what we call kind of like a galaxy in a bulb. It looked like the bell on the cat in Men in Black. The galaxies on Orion's bell. And it was very reminiscent of there's an episode of Rick and Morty called "The Ricks Must Be Crazy," where Rick has to go into a quote unquote teeny verse of his own creation inside the battery that powers his car. And after witnessing this in person, it's kind of hard to believe that our entire physical reality is not the creation of a very intelligent life form. We're essentially watching a miniaturized Big Bang and the creation of physical matter from electricity, which is probably one of the coolest things I could possibly imagine. And it brought me back to an experience I had probably 10 years ago now. So in my early 20s, I experimented with psychedelics a little bit, as a lot of people do. And the first time I smoked DMT, I experienced like what could best be described as like witnessing the Big Bang. And I basically, was like floating in the vacuum of space or the etheric fluid of space, depending on your perspective of physics, like outside my body, and like really just watched physical matter take form and galaxies form. And witnessing the cosmic induction generator took me right back to that out-of-body experience. And interesting enough, what really stuck out to me during that experience, when I was out of my body, I heard the words, "In the beginning, there was Om." And I always, it was so loud. It was like a booming voice. Like once I heard that, it snapped me back into my body to the point that I like jumped up and I actually like ran around my apartment at the time trying to see who was shouting at me, because like the voice was so loud. But I always interpreted it as like Om, like OM, like the universal frequency of creation used in Buddhist and yogic ceremonies and rituals, sometimes associated with Ganesh, which can correlate to the removal of obstacles. But like after going to this conference, I kind of had a different understanding of it. Like Om, OHM is the unit of measurement for resistance. And it was kind of like my brain had merged the spiritual with the electrical, and gave me like a more comprehensive understanding of reality. So I was kind of interpreted it like in the beginning frequency, but now I understand it as more of like in the beginning there was resistance, and like OHM, the omega sign, the unit of measurement of electrical resistance. Without resistance, electrical tension cannot occur and the creation cannot form, was kind of my new takeaway from those combined experiences. So to sum it up, like the more we learn, I think the more we realize how little we actually know. A year ago, me and Warren built a cloud chamber, which is kind of like a fish tank with a black light and dry ice fog. And you put a piece of radioactive ore in there, and you can actually see the particle emissions coming off from the radioactive ore, which was a really awesome like visual representation to try to understand the ether and what particle emissions actually look like in person. So it was a cool experiment. We took the dry ice ran out, and we took it down and put the radioactive ore in a box and put it away. And one day for fun, I put a piece of quartz inside the box that had the radioactive ore in it, just to see what would happen. And so I put it in there and forgot about it, and came back a couple of days later and took out my Geiger counter, and the quartz had actually become just as radioactive as the ore itself. And there's no current theory that explains how that's possible. It truly just doesn't make any sense. So it kind of like links back to, I think, how little we actually know about particle physics or the ether and radioactivity, and really just energy in general.
Wow. Yeah, I think that as far as like crystals and that is concerned, I feel like there's a ton of technology that has yet to be discovered with various crystals. And then when you talk about bringing radioactivity into the equation, I mean, who knows? The possibilities are just endless. But yeah, I wanted to go back to something about when you were talking about the electrons, or yeah, I think you were talking about the electrons and the theory and how they were kind of criticizing it. What is your understanding of, is it like a condition? Is that how you would summarize it, like a phenomenological condition? And like, where do you see that they had made some errors, and then how do you kind of conceive of what is being described when they're talking about electrons?
Yeah, so my understanding is that they're kind of referencing like the ether, and basically stating that Einsteinian physics is very flawed, and that because they couldn't either quantify or define or formulate how the ether functions, they invented something called the electron, because it fits in a neat little box that makes it easier to understand electrical theory. But it might make it easier to understand, but it doesn't seem like it's actually based in factual reality. But I mean, that would destroy everything we know about modern physics to say that the electron doesn't exist. I mean, we're going back to square one here now. So I don't know what that's going to look like in modern society if we're able to potentially rectify this mistake that was made decades and decades ago that took us really down the wrong path, or if we're just going to keep on trotting along and keep our head down and pretend that we didn't take a wrong turn in the woods decades ago. I can't quantify or formulate how the actual ether would function and how we can apply that towards electrical theory and engineering. But from my research, a lot of the smartest people in the world seem to agree that the electron may not be what we've made it out to be.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I think as far as like Einsteinian physics, it's just so funny to me. I've interviewed a lot of different engineers, and they've pretty much said along a lot of things along those same lines, that he wasn't exactly on the ball as much as he's portrayed. And it's just so interesting that he's kind of this iconic figure that represents like science and innovation, yet there are so many other brilliant minds that are just absolutely above and beyond. It's just funny to me.
Absolutely. I think there's a lot of people that don't get the credit that they deserve. Nikola Tesla being one of them, if not the main one. That dude was talking about transmitting matter in 1902. If we had followed his theories, who knows where we could be as a society right now. He supposedly wrote something called the dynamic theory of gravity that he chose not to publish for whatever reason, but it's reported that it would completely destroy everything we know about Einsteinian physics. And if he had published it, who knows, we could be living in a very different civilization right now.
Yeah, for sure. So there's a couple questions I wanted to get your thoughts on in regards to like the alchemical type stuff. And one of them was your kind of conception of the green lion and what that all represents. And then the philosophical Mercury, because those are two things, they're kind of debatable. A lot of people have different opinions on them, but I wanted to get kind of your assessment of those two terms.
For sure. The term green lion doesn't have a whole lot of significance to me personally. I think that the old school alchemists liked to speak in code, and so they invented fun, colorful language to address things that they didn't want people to know what they were talking about in public. So, my understanding is the green lion was their way of talking about, the spirit of metals without people knowing that they were talking about the spirit of metals. That being philosophic Mercury, which is another code since it has nothing to do with Mercury, other than the Mercury referring to spirit. But yeah, I've made philosophic Mercury. I've gone through the acetate path. I've taken my galena and crushed it up and burnt it and oxidized it and reacted it with acetic acid and taken my lead acetate and distilled it and made my philosophic Mercury, which was so cool to see. It's like you read about this in all of these classical alchemical textbooks, but until you actually get in the lab and do it, you don't really know what you're talking about or what you're looking at. But it kind of blows my mind that these old school alchemists literally using stone pots in the 1600s were able to figure this out. I mean, like these are hardcore chemical engineering applications. I mean, we're talking about pyrolysis that you have to burn at several hundred degrees Celsius in order to get your proper distillation, and then you're basically distilling a gas, which we were using like a quadruple like dry ice slurry cold trap with like 6 different condensers, and we still had some of the gas escape. So like I don't we're talking like temperatures of like negative 60 degrees in order to condense the philosophic Mercury back into a liquid. And the fact that these guys were doing this with stone pots back in the 1600s is pretty mind-blowing. But yeah, it was an experience that will stay with me forever. Me and Warren always called it the fog, because when you start distilling it looks like a fog that's coming through your glassware, because you're essentially distilling and condensing a gas.
Wow. Yeah, it definitely is mind-blowing. And especially thinking about way back in the day, how they did things like you were saying, like with different clay vessels or whatever. I was listening to a bunch of stuff recently about, I think the guy's name Rubophilos, and he goes super deep into the pyrolysis, and he was correlating a lot of the processes to like old biblical texts like Genesis, or like the Enuma Elish with the cuneiform tablet translations. And like when you start to look at what they're saying, it's really interesting how you can correspond the alchemical processes to those texts. So it was really blowing my mind. But yeah, that is a fascinating one. So yeah, you've had a lot of experience, and you've produced a lot of different things within the alchemical work. And I want to talk a little bit about kind of what some of your recent developments are and what you got going on as far as things that you're producing. And yeah, let's get into a little bit about that.
Yeah, totally. So, we Solar Nutraceuticals is my company, the main brand that I release products through, and we haven't really done a new product in a couple of years now. And so I've been kind of slowly working on something behind the scenes that I'm pretty excited about, and it's basically going to be a 1-to-1 hemp to Blue Lotus spagyric tincture. So to the people who are listening that aren't super familiar with Blue Lotus flowers were among the most cultivated ritual plants of ancient Egypt. They grew wild in ponds in the lowlands of the Nile and were planted in almost all the natural bodies of water. They were esteemed for their beauty, their enchanting, inebriating effects. So in ancient Egypt, the Blue Lotus was closely linked to the detailed and visionary concepts of the afterlife and rebirth. And numerous buds, petals, and garlands have been found as mummy decorations and grave goods. And the flower stands for an enlightened and reawakened consciousness of the deceased. So in the story of the battle between Horus and Set, actually, it's reported that the lotus flower appears as a symbol of the divine, all-seeing eye. And so when Seth tracks down the resting Horus beneath a tree in an oasis, he from Horus while he's sleeping and buries him in the sand. The story goes that they're transformed into lotus flowers. So because of the mythological, cosmological, symbolic, and artistic significance of the water lily, it's been suggested that the ancient Egyptians used the blue lotus for its narcotic effects to produce a shamanic ecstasy among their elite priesthood, which is super interesting. Based on more modern chemistry, we know that blue lotus contains the alkaloids apomorphine and luciferin, which are known to produce euphoric and aphrodisiac effects. It's also known as a flower of intuition and connection. So yeah, we're really excited. We're finishing up production next week, and we hope to have everything available for fulfillment in early October.
Wow, that's awesome. Yeah, I'm super stoked about it. And yeah, I think there's definitely a reason why we see so much interest in Blue Lotus right now, because it's fucking amazing. And I do want to say this. I think it's just awesome. Like when I see different alchemists, different people in the herbal community like yourself corresponding and like working and collaborating with others, and, to see other people sending products to each other and kind of having that community type aspect where it's not so much like, oh, let's be competitive and let's try to one up each other, and it's a more working with each other type of vibe. And I think that that's amazing, because I've seen that with like yourself and TJ or other people as well. And I think that that's something that's going to definitely propel just the whole art in general. But yeah, with that, I'm just going to leave the floor to you. If there's any last kind of statements or thoughts that you want to share with anybody, whatever you want, just go ahead.
Yeah, I think, in closing, I think I just kind of like echo the sentiment that you just referenced as far as kind of the sense of community developing within the alchemical realm. I think it's something definitely new. In the past, it seemed like everyone kind of just like held their cards super close to their chest, and no one wanted to talk about like how they're making their products or what they're making, or that everyone thought that they had discovered the one true way, and they wanted to keep it a secret just for themselves. And seeing more transparency and collaboration and kind of just more like friendships developing has been really heartwarming to watch and be a part of. So I think that's been really cool, and I kind of just really hope the field continues to develop that way.
Oh yes. All right. Well, I guess if that is all, what are some maybe any websites that you want to reference, or any places that you would like to throw out there for people to find out about you and your work and what you're up to and all of that?
Yeah, definitely. You can follow us on Instagram at Solar Nutraceuticals, and you can check out our website. You can either go to www.solaralchemy.club, or you can check out www.solarnutraceuticals.com, and it's spelled SOULAR.
Beautiful. Awesome. Well, this was absolutely amazing. I greatly appreciated this, and it was definitely a knowledge packed and illuminating podcast. So yeah, much appreciation. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Sky.